Many people believe that God can become anything, even human. In fact, many believe that God has already become human. But what does the Bible actually say? And does it make sense? In this video, we'll explore 3 key questions. What does reason and philosophy say about God taking on a body? What does the Bible actually say? And how should we respond to questions like, well, can't God do anything? In this video, we'll take an honest look, because understanding who God truly is matters. In previous videos, we have already established that God must be absolutely one. We've also established what this absolute unity means. In short, it means that God doesn't have any parts, limitation, or change. If God had a body, God would be limited by space, time, and the needs of physical form. But any being that is limited is by definition not all-powerful. But God must have infinite power, and that requires an infinite being, not a finite body. Moreover, a body is made up of parts, like arms, legs, organs. But something that is made up of parts is, well, for one, not infinite, and second, dependent on its parts for existence. And we know that God is infinite, and He is not dependent on anything. Bodies are also subject to change. They become old, for example. But God is eternal and unchanging. Further, a being with a brain can only think one thought at a time. It can only see from one point of view. Thus, we see from all of these proofs that a physical being cannot be omniscient, all-knowing, omnipresent, everywhere at the same time, and omnipotent, all-powerful. A body limits every divine attribute. So philosophy concludes that God cannot have a form or a body, and if you want further proof of what absolute unity means and why it means what it means, I encourage you to watch this video. But let's move on to what the Bible actually says. Well, Numbers 23:19 says, God is not a man that he should lie. 1 Samuel says, the Eternal One of Israel will not lie or change his mind, for he is not a man. Hosea 11 verse 9 is perhaps the most explicit, saying, for I am God, and not a man. And then we also find in Job. Job says that God is not a man like him. Now let's move to the event at Mount Sinai, where God spoke to the entire Jewish nation. On the recounting of the Mount Sinai event, Deuteronomy 4 verses 15 to 16 say, you saw no form on the day the Lord spoke to you at Horeb. Therefore, do not act corruptly, and make for yourselves a graven image, in the likeness of a male or a female. Here, God tells us, you saw no form, and do not imagine me as if I had a form. Another proof in Deuteronomy. Know today and take it to heart that the Lord is God in the heavens above and the earth below. But a body cannot be in 2 places at the same time, the heaven above and the earth below. Only a non-physical being can transcend space like this. And one last verse for reflection. In Isaiah, God says, to whom can you liken me? With whom shall I be equal? If God were ever a man, he could be likened or compared to another man, which this verse says is impossible. Nothing can be compared to God, not even a man. Okay, now we'll address the most common counter-argument, and you may even be thinking it to yourself. But can't God do anything? The answer is yes. God can do anything that is truly possible. But God cannot do things that are self-contradictory, things that cannot happen. So let's explain. Imagine trying to make a square circle. Can you make a square circle? No matter how hard you try, you cannot make a square circle. Why? Because it's not a thing that can actually happen. Because a square circle is not a thing. It's a contradiction in terms. A square, by definition, cannot be a circle, and vice versa. You can't make a square circle because a square, by definition, has 4 straight sides and 4 90-degree angles, whereas a circle, by definition, has to be round where all points are equidistant from the center. Thus, stringing together the words square circle is stringing together 2 contradictory words. There is no such possibility or existence of something that can be a square circle. It's nonsense. And so similarly, God cannot do nonsense. Not because he is weak, but because it's not a real possibility that can be done. We've already seen in this video that God cannot lie. Does that mean that God is weak? No. It just means that lying contradicts God's perfect nature. And thus, it's not a thing that can actually be done. Similarly, God cannot stop being God. Why? Because it would contradict his nature. God also can't cease to exist. God's essence includes absolute unity, which means that he must be eternal. Again, we arrive at the same conclusion. He can't cease to exist because doing so is something that can't actually happen. And finally, God can't be both infinite and finite at the same time. Why? Because again, it's not a real possibility. They're just contradictory terms, just like square circle. Nothing can be infinitely finite or finitely infinite. So what does God is omnipotent, all-powerful, actually mean? True omnipotence means that God can do all things that are logically possible and consistent with his perfect, infinite nature. So what would it mean if God became a man? It would mean that God became limited. He would be bound by space and time. He'd be subject to change and decay. He would thus cease to be infinite and perfect. That's not power. That's losing his divinity. He would cease to be God. Here's a simple analogy. Light can't become darkness without first ceasing to be light. In the same way, God cannot become human without first ceasing to be God. Now, maybe somebody may ask, but can't God do things that we don't understand? Absolutely. God does countless things that we do not understand. But this is different. A self-contradiction isn't something we don't understand. It's something that can't exist at all. Saying God became a man is like saying God became a square circle. It sounds like a sentence, but it's just nonsense dressed up in words. So again, to say that God became a man is to say that God stopped being God. That's not divine power. That's a logical impossibility. It's something that cannot happen. It's not a real possibility. Now here's another genuine question. Doesn't the Bible describe God with human-like features? Indeed, when referring to God, the Bible sometimes uses terms like below his feet, written by the finger of God, God's hand, God's eyes, God's ears, and many more. But here's the key point, and here's the answer to the question. These are all metaphors. They're not supposed to be taken literally. So why does the Bible speak this way? The Torah was given to all people, not just to philosophers or to mystics. It speaks in everyday human language, in language that we can all relate to. Since most humans think in physical sensory terms, the Torah uses metaphors to convey deeper truths. This is all made clear in Deuteronomy 32 verse 41, when God says, "If I whet my lightning sword." Now, does God actually have a sword? Does God need a weapon to act? Of course not. This is metaphoric imagery. It's a way to express God's power and justice in ways that people can actually understand. Another proof of this concept are the different prophetic visions of God. Daniel sees God clothed in white like snow, while Isaiah sees God in crimson garments. These images, white garments versus red garments, contradict each other. This contradiction tells us that neither vision is literal. Rather, each one conveys a different spiritual message through symbolic imagery. These examples all point to the same truth. God has no image, body, or form. God cannot be truly limited or described in human terms. But what about emotions like anger or joy? Don't emotions require change? Well, we read that God laughs, God rejoices, God becomes angry. But again, these are only metaphors. The sages taught the Torah speaks in the language of man. God does not have emotions like we do. Emotions imply change, and we see in Malachi, I, the Lord, do not change. Further, Jeremiah 7 verse 19 says that God is not emotionally reactive. For man's sin doesn't hurt God necessarily. It really hurts the sinner. God is eternal and perfect. Now we'll close with one final verse. In Exodus 33:20, God tells Moses, "You cannot see my face, for no man shall see me and live." First, This verse implies that if God became human, anybody who saw his face would die, for no man can see his face and live. But if God truly had a face, why would it be fatal? The answer is he doesn't have a face. His essence is beyond physicality. His face refers to God's essence, which no living being can fully grasp. Since our minds are finite, God appears in ways that we can grasp, through visions, metaphors, and symbols. But none of these are literal descriptions of God's essence. So in this video, we've seen that through philosophy and reason, scripture, and honest interpretation, that God does not and cannot have a body or form. God is not human, nor can he become human, because doing so would contradict his infinite and perfect nature. It's not a thing that can actually happen. It's not a real possibility. Now, the Bible uses metaphors to help us relate to the divine, but we must not confuse metaphor with reality. To claim that God became a man is not only unsupported by Scripture, it fundamentally contradicts what the Bible teaches us about God's oneness, transcendence, and perfection. If at this point you're thinking about miracles, stay tuned because I will have a video on that soon. But in any case, I hope you enjoyed this video, learned something. Thank you for watching.